Live from our hurricane headquarters with real-time analysis from some of the nation's top meteorologists, this is Tracking the Tropics, powered by Bose Electric.
Welcome to our weekly edition of Tracking the Tropics, and that's a beautiful sight, especially after this time last week. We were tracking the landfall of Hurricane Melissa on Tracking the Tropics last week, just at this time, and now we are looking at no tropical development expected for the next 7 days. That is a beautiful sight. We sure wish we could have skipped last week and done that the whole season. I'm meteorologist Rebecca Berry here at the WFLA Streaming Center, joined by our superhero. It's our meteorologist Juliana Mejia. She does all the heavy lifting for Tracking the Tropics, preparing all the graphics and getting everything ready to help you stay more informed. And whew, it's been a long week. We were talking about that earlier.
Yeah, it's hard to believe because it feels like so much time has passed already. This is literally just 7 days ago. And I actually have the satellite imagery here. And it's tough because, satellite data will only stay live for so long, in this case, like in the system for so long. So it'll load in here in a moment. But, this being quite literally the end of that lapse that we have is what we were tracking 7 days ago, almost on the dot. And I guess we both kind of wanted to just take almost some time to talk a little bit more about Melissa kind of now, as we've all been just in awe of the storm and having shattered so many records and tied so many records, of course, without, even hesitation, saying just what a monster of a storm. Luckily, though, like you mentioned, we have been on this now consistent streak for the last week, and it looks like kind of we'll have the opportunity to hopefully ring out the end of hurricane season with Melissa and keep the rest of the Atlantic Basin quiet. So for now, we're 26 days away from the end of hurricane season. And this is all in all, regardless of even the specific, elements in the atmosphere right now, generally speaking, this is really when things start to peter out. So Melissa, of course, for those, maybe who haven't been as tuned in with how the storm played out, having made landfall in Jamaica, the second landfall in Cuba, and then also having washed over the Bahamas. And so that was something I had, kind of focused on quite a bit last week, was just how widespread the damage was and how widespread the impacts were from this system. And you can even just see on satellite how large it was. But here's a great graph. Now, shout out to Chief Meteorologist Jeff Berardelli having put a lot of this together as well, with the statistics of having been the strongest, tying for the strongest landfall in the Atlantic Basin. Max winds at 185 miles per hour. This is the third strongest Atlantic hurricane. Also, one of the more interesting elements that had, happened over the course of Melissa's life was having the world record for the driest and clearest eye. And something that stood out to me was just even how long that eye was, so organized and so clear, and so perfectly circular for quite some time. But also something we've talked about is the most intense, both in terms of strongest landfall, both in terms of wind speeds and pressure. So having tied the Labor Day hurricane of 1935 for the lowest pressure at landfall in particular, and then in this case, a three-way tie between Melissa, Dorian in 2019, and the Labor Day hurricane as well, with 185 mile per hour winds at landfall. So at this point, it has in fact been, and it shook out to be, an above average season. The accumulated energy ACE landing at 127, and usually on average we're sitting around 117 at this point in the season. 4 major hurricanes, which overall, just on average throughout a given season, we only typically see 3 majors. And so many of them having, 3 of them been, or let's see, the 3 of them being Cat 5 hurricanes. So that was also a lot of discussion around that too. It's just how, I want to say rigorous, or how aggressive, despite, what I think a lot of people were anticipating and tend to anticipate when we talk about an above average season, is the number of systems. In this case, the season being more of an aggressive season with the storms that did develop, less so the number of storms that we saw.
I felt like we had a lot of days where we had a Cat 5 storm because the Cat 5 storms that did form, other than Melissa, didn't really end up impacting many areas. They did stay out over the open Atlantic. And so I did think that gave us more days having a Cat 5 system out there than we typically see. It's hard for a system to maintain that Cat 5 strength, but especially with the warmer waters and the lack of shear, the storms that stayed out there in those very friendly zones were able to survive for a very long time. And that's one of the reasons that we ended up above average in terms of ACE. And that's the weakness of ACE as a measurement of the season, is that we had 0 U.S. landfalls, but we had above average ACE. And so you do have to take those parameters with a grain of salt, if you will, or at least understand what they mean in terms of what the impact could be on your area. ACE is not necessarily a great indication of that.
Yeah. Is there anything, luckily also here, this is something that was interesting as well. Again, shout out to Chief Meteorologist Jeff Bardelli for having put this together of the wake of Melissa. We also saw this, was it Aaron earlier in the season, that having churned up the water so intensely, leaving a cold wake, and still seeing generally the cold wake here, but that's the ocean heat potential, kind of visualizing that overall. We're with all the parameters in the season at this point that just tend to wind down. You can see, if you look closely along the coast, sea surface temperatures. I've been watching it. We've all been watching it as we do the boating forecast for our local forecast. We're like, Gulf temperatures are tipping over into the 60s now. So that's, of course, right along the shore, but we're getting to that point in the season. So things generally winding down. I guess a quick note as well, because we also want to kind of look over some of, quite literally, the visual damage left behind from Melissa. Yeah, and I'm sure you all have, that are weather, enthusiasts have been plugged into the extended tropical outlook, both the 2-week and the 3-week, kind of highlighting portions of the Caribbean. But it's just really, from what I've seen, a fairly weak signal. It does. And also to note, too, that even if something were to pop up in the Caribbean, it's probably just going to drift over into Central America. So no tropical developments expected. And even if something were to pop up, I think we're going to ride out this season without impacts to the United States or direct impacts from any additional system.
Yeah, we haven't done that in years, and it's really hard after the second powerful cold front of October to get into the Gulf, and that's what we have headed our way for, the end of the weekend, beginning of next week, is that second really powerful cold front plunging us potentially into the 40s overnight, and that just changes, the flow of that zonal flow across the U.S., and the jet stream dips further south, and it's just really hard to get into the Gulf once that happens. So I'm not calling it yet, but I'm optimistic that we're headed that way.
Yeah.
I did a deep dive because I thought it was really interesting, the news that was coming out about Jamaica's disaster bond. And so I made some notes here. They had a catastrophe bond with an insurance company that specializes in that, because Jamaica's rated by that same insurance industry as the third most exposed country to natural disasters. And so basically Jamaica has taken out an insurance policy, and for natural disasters, they have a tropical cyclone, and that's what is about to pay out. It's going to be the highest payout of this type ever. It's going to be $70.8 million, and it's going to happen within weeks instead of months. And they also have an excessive rainfall policy. They haven't quite calculated that. That takes longer. So they're going to get a second payout from this insurance bond. And it's really a wise move on Jamaica's part, because they're going to get this influx of cash to start fixing infrastructure, to start fixing hospital and medical facilities. It's not going to touch what they eventually have to pay to get back to whole, basically, because that's estimated around $8 billion right now.
Yeah.
But that immediate influx of cash, plus they have already pre-established lines of credit in this, that they can get another $800 million almost immediately just for that. So this is going to be something that the whole world is watching, basically, in terms of how you accomplish this and how this helps rebuilding infrastructure and making it better for the next time, for the next storm. This is not the first payout that they've taken of this type. In 2024, they got $26.2 million for Hurricane Beryl. And in 2020, they took payouts for tropical cyclones Zeta and Eta. That was the year that we went into the Greek alphabet. And I know you guys might have some interesting thoughts and questions on this. I want to remind you that this is an interactive program. If you have anything you want to weigh in about, if you have any questions about what we're talking about or hurricanes in general, you just have to use the hashtags #HeyJuliana or #HeyRebecca, and we'll be able to pull your comments on the screen, and we'll be able to answer those questions. And then we'll be, of course, looking for those comments as well. The last parts on that payout that we were just talking about, it's going to be the largest and fastest disaster relief payout ever. And they're going to be getting that second payout. And it was really interesting the way that the insurance company broke down this tropical cyclone payout. They took Jamaica and they divided it into different quadrants. And so and then they had a central pressure for each quadrant. If a tropical cyclone's it dropped below like 962 over Kingston, then it triggered a payout. And each different quadrant had different payouts. And so it was really, really wild to see how they were going to calculate this payout. And if we had seen more damage closer to Kingston, which, by the way, didn't even have widespread power outages because they just saw tropical storm force winds, their payout would have been much, much higher because Kingston is such a populated area. So we're really lucky that this didn't impact Kingston harder. We would have seen a much higher loss of life, even though we aren't even starting to hear numbers about that yet because communications are so down. Yeah. What I've pulled up for us right now is the NOAA satellite imagery. They've made passes over the most hard-hit areas and provided us with those images, and we're going to start zooming in and kind of digging deep on the damage that we can see from the satellite. But first, I want to get your questions going because, of course, this is an interactive program. So if you do have a question, use that hashtag, #HeyRebecca or #HeyJuliana, and we'll be able to pull your questions in, just like this one right here from TikTok. Thanks for watching us live on TikTok. We're live on Facebook as well. And so this one says, is Melissa still around? Thank goodness, no.
Long gone, long off the map. That raced off. Once it got picked up by the mid upper levels, it raced off into the North Atlantic.
Yes. And so we were so happy for that. Melissa didn't move until Melissa really moved. Yeah. And so that storm had such slow forward motion in the beginning. And then by the end, it was racing at like 20 or 30 miles per hour once it got picked up by the front. We've got another featured comment, #HeyRebecca. How long does hurricane season last? Isn't it fall already? This is about the time I kind of start ignoring hurricane season because that second tropical front is here. And we are, of course, a little less concerned about them making it to us, but technically November 30th is the end of hurricane season. So we'll be throwing a party here in the weather office for the end of this hurricane season. So far, with no U.S. landfalls, this has been one of our favorite. And this one's an interesting comment coming from Luke saying, #HeyJuliana, what made Melissa so strong?
Really, I think one of the key players that all meteorologists were pointing to and talking about was the very, very warm sea surface temperatures. And again, Jeff Baradelli, Chief Meteorologist Jeff Baradelli, having put together so much interesting information in all the nitty-gritty stats here, that in something what we see and becomes a problem is with warm sea surface temperatures, these systems have a better opportunity to rapidly intensify. And unfortunately, we've seen now, and I wouldn't be surprised to see this become almost, a term that becomes part of the verbiage. If there's rapid intensification, and now there's what we have to refer to as extreme rapid intensification because it's taking on almost a whole new level, quite literally. So rapid intensification is a 35 mile per hour increase in a 24-hour, within at least 24 hours, or I should say at least 35 miles per hour of an increase within 24 hours of a tropical system. And in this case, measuring this as a 70 mile per hour increase within 24 hours, what previously was just 3 systems from 1980 to 2002, generally speaking, now we see this happen 6 times more, which is, again, just an indicator of what we all know and have seen in real time is each and every season seeing obnoxiously hot. You can't even call it warm sea surface temperatures. These are hot sea surface temperatures that just consistently run warmer than normal. And you still see that. So again, like locally along our shore, things are easing up, but the Caribbean right now, portions of the Gulf out into the main development region across the Atlantic are still very warm at this point in the season. So that's the main key player there, along with then all the other elements, the lack of wind shear having come together to support just this unfortunately perfect environment for Melissa.
Absolutely. And we have an interesting question coming in here before we get to, I really want to get to that satellite imagery and the damage, so we'll get to that next. But this one coming from Adam, #Hey Rebecca, I didn't catch the payout thing entirely. What made it so fast? And so what makes that payout so fast is Jamaica, instead of setting something up within its own government to try to set aside money for this, they took out an insurance policy on themselves through a private company, a private industry. And so instead of voting and legislating and all the things that take so much time, it's a payout. Just like if you were to get into a car accident this afternoon, your car insurance would have your car evaluated, and if they decided that it wasn't worth fixing and it was totaled, you would get a check within a day or two. And so, or not a check now, it's all, I'm old, but they just put the money in your account. but that's what made it so fast, is they went with a private industry, basically insurance policy against natural disasters. And so that's why they're getting that money so fast, which is so needed in a situation like this. I'm going to switch this back over. So this is the satellite imagery, and we're going to be focusing kind of on the landfall area first. And so you can see Kingston over there on the just south of Spanish Town right there. They didn't even have a lot of power outages there. So that's how tight this wind field was. And that's how basically tight the damage circle has been. So I kind of want to start on the southern edge of this, because that's where the worst of the storm surge was, because it was to the east of the eye, basically. And when you start to zoom in, you can see how the water still churned up. This is not what Jamaica water looks like. Jamaica water looks like those sandals commercials for resorts. They're beautiful and clear, and you can see how churned up it is. And then also how far the mud went in. Like, this is normally lush green. This is the mud lines right up here somewhere where you stop seeing mud. And so that's wild that we had water over all of that, and unfortunately the sand and the mud as well. But then you go down to these poor homes that were just basically, like, I'm impressed some of them are still standing, because this is the type of storm surge that could completely wipe a home off of its base, like we saw with Katrina down in Mississippi. But some of these structures still have roofs. Not all of them. You can see right there just, what was probably a pretty well-constructed home based on what you're seeing that's left of it. But the roof just completely gone there on part of one side of it. And you can see all these, all the debris, it's just really terrible. And even on the beach side here, that says it's a business tan beach, but the beach, not anything what it used to be, just completely not recognizable there with the rocks and the lack of sand, just changing unfortunately, the landscape here. Some of the worst of the damage right here, you can see basically just washed away structures right there. We're going to zoom out a little bit just for perspective, since, I've never been to Jamaica. I'm not intimately familiar with it. But then it's also wild to see that solar panels survived on some roofs. Like, that's incredible construction. Now it does look like on the southern edge right there, something got completely wiped off of its base right there. Maybe a pool and that little tiki hut. But that little compound faring a lot better than a lot of its counterparts, certainly. And this is another interesting part of this discussion, is how do you rebuild back? And we saw it in the Keys in the early 2000s, the hurricanes that swept through there, the newer construction homes that were built up to the newer codes, that were up on stilts, that did have the hurricane straps, and that did have the rebar, and all the things that they've changed about building codes, they were effective. Those houses were essentially okay. It was the older homes. So you do have to wonder, especially since Jamaica was so responsible with and had the foresight to take out that payout, if they change the way that they rebuild the infrastructure, like the roads, to be a little bit more resilient, because even these beachfront homes like this, just taking a wallop, really sad to see. Yeah.
And you at least in my experience, having spent more time in Southwest Florida, that's the norm now, looking around in coastal communities or driving around portions of Fort Myers Beach, just about anywhere along Southwest Florida's coast, and I'm sure up in our area as well, that is the norm, is seeing homes built up on stilts and built a floor 2 floors up sometimes.
Yeah.
And again, I think seeing more and more of that, I think for most places moving forward, especially then in this case where you have no option but to start from scratch. I'm sure we'll see more of that. I want to say worldwide, but internationally speaking, for tropical areas that deal with tropical systems.
Yes, absolutely. And then you look at something like this, which was probably some type of hotel. I mean, it's just completely gutted,
Wow.
Oh.
I think what is difficult until you see it firsthand to like wrap your head around is how long it really takes to recover. Because sure, of course we go into immediate cleanup after a hurricane passes through, but I went out to Fort Myers Beach a year and a half, almost 2 years later, and there were still bricks buried in sand. Like there are cement blocks that get buried. So there's so much stuff also because of the way the mud slides in, because of the way the shore gets pushed in and all the sand gets churned up. And then there's dangerous stuff buried everywhere around you that is hard to dig up and then find, a place to put it all. It's so hard to see.
Yeah, it's just so hard to see. We're getting a little closer to the landfalling portions of it, and you can tell that, these big cement walls just breached. And even, this looks like a giant, mega home, and it looks like even parts of it didn't survive. We're seeing a lot of boats kind of strewn across the roadways too. And then when you have a break in the building there, then you can kind of see how much the sand is pushed in, like you were just talking about in Fort Myers. How far the sand goes in, how far the water goes in. It looks like the water was still inundating part of this area when the satellite made it pass.
In a way.
Ugh.
And got trapped.
That whole structure right there just completely collapsed.
Which, we've talked about this too, is looking at this giant puddle ponding of water is what we see a lot of injuries and sometimes deaths after in the cleanup of systems. And what has happened before too is bacterial infections that you can end up with, and people with exposed going out either during or after, immediately after storms, and getting hurt, or like you said, in the cleanup with tools maybe people aren't as familiar with. There's risk just kind of left and right, before, during, after the worst of a storm.
Look at those boats buried in the sand.
Wow.
That breaks my heart.
Wow.
Oh no. Oh gosh. We've got boats across the road here. So there must have been some sort of marina or something a little closer to here, because there's certainly a concentration of boats washed up in that one area. I was following a captain that was moving boats to the mangroves. They were more the super yachts. He was not anywhere near the landfalling location, so most of those did well. But they do that in the Keys as well. They kind of drive the boats up and sit them in the mangroves, because the mangroves reduce the storm surge action and the waves so much that a lot of times a boat can survive that.
Wow.
And we only have a few more minutes left here, but I did want to go up the mountain a little, because what we're looking at, in addition to wind damage, is storm surge damage. But the heaviest of the winds occurred up the mountain a bit. Yesterday I was kind of scrolling across this to see if it would be interesting to anyone other than me, and I hope it is. But I ended up seeing a whole field of palm trees just flattened.
Wow.
And it just really, when you think about it, our Florida storms, it's always awful when you go out the day after, but the palm trees are still there. It takes a lot to flatten palm trees.
Yeah, palm tree down.
They're essentially made to survive these systems. But I don't think there's a tree standing in these locations.
No.
I mean, when you look at this, these are just completely flattened trees.
Pine needles strewn across the ground.
And so that's going to be a horrific fire danger once this dries out with all of that dead wood. And so they'll have to unfortunately address that. But of course, you address people first, and then you start worrying about, cleaning up the woods.
Wow.
But just terrible. Let's see if I can get closer to that region I was talking about. So then you get up to some of the roads, and so you can start looking at some of the homes. It looks like this was mainly farmland. Mm-hmm. Not a lot of structures here. And this was too high to have seen any of that storm surge damage, but excessive rainfall. This is where we would be looking for some of the flooding from excessive rainfall. Mm-hmm. But once you get up the mountain where the eye wall went, there's no roofs left. There's no like, oh, that's a new one and they had a roof left. It looks more like this. Like, nope, nothing left. Just terrible wind damage. And so more of those just flattened trees. And it looks like not only roofs gone, but also entire structures, maybe weaker structures being just completely blown apart as well. Ooh.
Oh. And that's, the importance of evacuation orders, like, that just displays it because I think it's easy to feel safe in your home.
Oh,
and
absolutely.
Especially if you have a newer construction, it is very easy to want to take shelter at home and stay with your home. That's understandable, rather than abandoning something, you've invested in and, built a life in. But this very, in a potent way shows how against a system this strong, they'll look brittle.
Yes. And so here's the palm trees I was looking at. Oh,
wow.
Just, completely flattened. It's completely changed the landscape. And this road that there are going to be parts of it that are impassable because of all the trees down,
Mm-hmm.
And so that's just going to continue to be an issue that they have to work through. And then, of course, we get out of the touristy areas up in the mountains like these, and the structures look like they have even heavier damage, unfortunately. All right, this is the last call for questions. We only have a moment or two left. I was going to take this one. Hashtag, hey, Rebecca, we know the number of Cat 5 storms has increased dramatically. Is there a metric that tracks the number of days these storms are active, regardless of the threat to land? And so that is an interesting concept. And I do believe that there are metrics that people are tracking days of Category 5 hurricanes. I don't have those stats handy for us. This season would have led heavily on that, though.
Yes.
Yeah. And so thank you for joining us for this episode of Tracking the Tropics. I'm going to leave the final thoughts with Juliana here. We got about 30 seconds.
I am fingers crossed. I think the last thoughts there is all of our thinking that we're going to hopefully ride out the rest of the season without any issues.
Yes.
And of course, as always, still thinking of all the people affected by Melissa.
Yes, we'll be talking about that story for a long time to come. I am happy that they're getting that insurance payout to hopefully help them get back on their feet, but that is a country that will need our help for a long time. Next week, we'll be kind of recapping what's going on and maybe taking a look at what's going on in the field of science in terms of hurricane forecasting. I hope you'll join us right here on Tracking the Tropics, Tuesday at 12:30.